Right now, I want to welcome from Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership, Dr. Robert Young. Dr. Young, thank you, sir, for coming on the show.
Cam, thank you for inviting me. You just gave me a new life goal to become a meat puppet someday.
Work hard. There's about a 10-year internship process, I understand. But listen, I do appreciate you coming on the program, and I really thought your piece, Docs, Glocks, and Patients, well worth reading. It's very, very thoughtful. You're talking about the Docs versus Glocks law, the Florida law that prevents doctors from grilling their patients about gun ownership and lecturing them on gun ownership. And you say, first of all, it's sad that it got to this point, right?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think anyone likes the idea of any part of the government telling us what we can or can't do, right?
But at the same time, you also you support this law.
I'm perfectly content with that law. I guess I would say I'm just sad that it had to get to that point. I think your word grilling is a good choice, probably. I think if certain doctors in Florida had not been grilling their patients about gun ownership as if it were something bad, something to be combated, the same way you'd want to make sure water is clean and people lock up their chemicals and they make sure to keep their toddlers away from the stove, then I don't think this would have happened. But it's very true. A lot of doctors do not understand guns because they don't own them, they haven't grown up with them, and many of the medical specialty organizations have come to the conclusion that you can treat guns as some kind of vector of disease when the real vector are those people who misuse and or have no idea how to handle them and take care of them.
And I think that's important to understand here because, for people who aren't really paying attention to the issue, they may not understand the guns as public health argument that is first came out, I think, of the mid 90s and then sort of went away for a while and has now been resurrected. There was a piece not long ago in the Washington Post by a guy who said, if we can only get people to start thinking about guns as a public health issue, then all of a sudden there can be this real cultural mindset shift in terms of firearms. Because as you say, you use that word disease vector. And that is the mindset of some of these doctors that, well, if you're a gun owner, then you're a vector for all kinds of ills and problems here. So we've got to warn you. We've got to warn you of the dangers of your gun ownership.
Yes, that's exactly the way the thinking goes. The statistics behind that are curious, to say the least. Just like many statistics on the gun control side of the questions, there's some huge number of 30, 40 to 1 odds of someone getting hurt by a gun if it's in your household. But I think, as many of your listeners, and certainly it's really not an accurate number. That has to do with whether or not there are guns somewhere within 100 yards, and if you cut out the older kids up to age 24, for example, and you just look at the younger kids up to even 14, you're looking at 60 to 80 accidental gun deaths a year. Now compare that to, in another piece I wrote about how many people physicians kill each year, probably 100,000 or more by accident. We all know there are 30-some thousand motor vehicle accidental deaths. Kids die by drowning, by poisoning, by falls, far more frequently in those accidents. Now, all those things are well worth cautioning people about and offering advice as to how to stay safe. But I have to think that the gun problem is not so much one.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the number of deaths due to medical mistakes in this country. I know the numbers are, we don't have any real firm numbers. I've seen estimates, as you said, of 100,000 per year to perhaps as many as fourfold per year, which would be a staggeringly high number. But I have noticed, Dr. Young, that a lot of medical professionals, they get very incensed when you bring this up. When you talk about well, what do we talk about patient safety in terms of what should you do when you go to the hospital? What should you do to make sure that you're not a victim of medical mistakes? Boy, you can get some medical professionals really cheesed off at you when you bring this up, Doc.
Well, there's one good thing. Since we're on that subject, there's one thing any of us can do as patients, which is every time someone comes in to examine you, insist that they wash their hands where you can see them do it. We should always do that in between patients. And the chief problem in what we call nosocomial infections brought about in the place of treatment, for example, is when caretakers are not washing their hands between patients.
Yeah.
If you want to be sure it happens, watch it happen. You can also watch the physicians and nurses get very upset at being questioned that way. But when I'm in the hospital, that's what I want to see.
Well, and as you say, as you write, you say ultimately the doctor-patient relationship takes place by mutual consent, and it only succeeds if it's respectfully and caringly attended to. And that's a two-way street. That's the patient and the physician working to keep that relationship in that regard.
Yes. When I was growing up, I'm just a little bit older than you, Cam. Doctors were clearly the authority figures, and I still have plenty of older patients who say, well, you're the doc, just tell me what to do. And that's fine. But really the model now that's been taught for 20 to 30 years is that we are working together. That means we are to pay attention to the patient where the patient is. We are to seek whatever needs to be treated to make sure we're serving the patient's interest in what they need done. And I think as a corollary, we don't need to focus on the things they don't need done.
Amen. I'd agree with you there, Doctor. So, you are far, as you say, many doctors they're not really familiar with firearms. They may treat gunshot injuries, but they don't own guns themselves. And so they have a perspective of, look, I see people come in here with gunshot injuries. If we ban guns, if we, more regulated guns, then maybe I wouldn't see as many of these injuries. But I've also had communication with trauma surgeons in, big cities with lots of crime victims. And they're gun owners, and they own firearms for personal protection. So is this I wonder, is this a debate within the medical community as well?
Well, we'd like it to be. There are a few of us, as Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership represents, who I think, as I have, as Tim Wheeler, the founder and director, has, and a number of other doctors, decided to look at both sides of this. And as you and your listeners well know, people who look at both sides of the gun issue end up realizing that most of the valuable data, the meaningful data, the accurate data, and logic falls on the gun rights side. But you have to look at it. If I were a trauma surgeon who had no experience with guns since I was a child, which I had, and I only saw gunshot wounds, I could certainly take that position. It's just too scary if you haven't taken the time to study it and understand it, and you see those terrible consequences as your only experience.
What do you think, Dr. Young, would there be any benefit, you think, at looking at guns as a public health issue, or does that completely miss the point? Well,
I'll say it mostly misses the point. I think there are ways that could be defined usefully that way, but again, as I mentioned, the vector is not the gun.
Yeah.
It's certain people and how they use it and how they misuse it. So, no, not the gun issue about guns, no. It's a people issue, just like a lot of other things.
Well, listen, Dr. Young, I appreciate you coming on the program, sir. Thank you so much, and hope we can do this again soon.
Well, sure. If people are interested in what I'm writing, it's various places, but generally you'll find it on drgo.us. And very happy to be here, Cam. Thanks a lot.
You bet. Thank you, sir. We'll talk again soon. Dr. Robert Young from Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership. Again, drgo.us.